Good morning, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Allison Gingold. I am past chair of JPAC and the Summit Committee chair this year. And I'm really happy to see this huge turnout this morning, and I really, really appreciate all of you for being here this morning and for showing up. So I have the pleasure to welcome two preeminent Sacramento journalists who will be speaking on and discussing the state of our legislature. Our first one is Laurel Rosenhall. Laurel Rosenhall is an LA Times Sacramento bureau chief, overseeing the Times coverage of the California Capitol, state government, and state politics. She joined the company in 2021 and spent a year as a member of the editorial board writing about California politics, policy, and power. Before joining the Times, she covered state politics for CalMatters and the Sacramento Bee. A lifelong Californian, she grew up in San Francisco and graduated from the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. We also have with Laurel, Dan Walters. For those of you who don't know Dan has been a covering journalist for over 60 years, mostly working for California newspapers. At age 22, he was the nation's youngest daily newspaper editor. He became Sacramento Union's Capitol bureau chief and then began writing the state's only daily newspaper column devoted to California political, economic, and social events. In 1984, he and the column moved to the Sacramento Bee, and in 2017 to CalMatters. He has written more than 10,000 articles, and his column appears in dozens of newspapers. He frequently appears on CNN and other networks, commenting about political developments in California. Will you please welcome to the stage both Dan and Laurel.
Thanks for having me. As a personal side note, I grew up in the Jewish community in San Francisco, which actually programs in the community helped me launch my career in journalism. My very first internship, I think I was only in high school, was at what was then known as the Jewish Bulletin, which was a weekly community newspaper in San Francisco that now goes by J. So anyway, as a personal side note. But I have been in Sacramento for about 20 years and had the pleasure to work with Dan Walters both at the Bee and at CalMatters. And I guess I would just start off with a couple of comments, and then I know Dan's going to talk about the budget. But as far as just understanding the political dynamics in Sacramento, if you're used to following politics in Washington, then you just have to kind of throw all of your understanding of political dynamics kind of out of your mind and completely think about things in a different way. The Democrats have such an enormous majority here and control over everything that the partisan kind of brinksmanship and the partisan stalemates that are so common in Washington really are not at play here. The most prevalent kind of political dynamic in Sacramento are the tensions among Democrats and how much they split, what issues they split on, and how big the Democratic caucus is can kind of have a factor in that. When the Democratic caucus is smaller, the more business-friendly and moderate Democrats tend to have more influence. They can kind of join with the Republicans and stop some of the progressive agenda. And in recent years, the caucus has grown so large, the Democratic majority is so big, they have about 3/4 of the seats in the legislature, that we're sort of seeing an evolution toward other forces that are being used to stop the agenda or like as a check on Democratic control that are outside the Capitol. And so we're increasingly see like big business put measures on the ballot to overturn laws that are passed in Sacramento or try to modify them. We're seeing a lot of laws that are passed here go to the courts, and many of them are getting thrown out in the courts. So I would just kind of, if I look at kind of the the forest of the political dynamics. That would be kind of my observation over the years, is that, you know, with one party control here, we're really seeing a lot more of the tensions are among Democrats, and then other forces that don't like what's happening here are using these other avenues like the ballots and the courts. And so that's just something to keep in mind if you're trying to sort of understand how things work here.
All right, thank you, Laurel. One of the areas in which that dynamic that Laurel outlined is very evident is in the state budget. It's the single most important thing that the legislature does every year, and it has immense impacts. It's difficult to put that in some kind of perspective, but if you actually take the state budget and add to it the federal funds that the state passes through, you're looking at the better part of $500 billion that is designated for spending out of the state, out of the legislature and in the state budget. And as the budget has grown, and let me say parenthetically, when I started covering the Capitol in 1975, the state budget was like $10 billion. Now it's more like $300 billion, not counting those federal funds I mentioned. As the budget has grown, it has also become more complex because the laws governing the budget have become more complex, and because California itself has become more complex, with many, many more people looking to the budget for support. And you heard a couple of examples of that earlier today. But more recently, the problem with the budget has been the difficulty in determining state revenues. Now I'm going to throw a little wonky facts at you here to begin with. The state budget consists of both the general fund budget and a whole bunch of special fund budgets, the highway budget special, the fish and game budget special, and so forth. But if you look at the general fund budget, about 3/4 of the money to support that general fund budget comes from the personal income tax, which itself is a big change over the years. When I came to the Capitol in 1975, the sales tax was the most important source of revenue for the state. But over time, it became the personal income tax. And because California has a relatively progressive income tax, in the sense of how you define that word in terms of taxation, a tremendous amount of money, the vast majority of that money comes for the general fund budget. And the general fund budget covers prisons and schools and colleges and all the kind of big things that we talk about. The bulk of that money comes from not only from the personal income tax, but from the wealthiest taxpayers in the state. For example, the top 1% of taxpayers, and that's about 160,000 people in a state of 40 million, pay about half of those income taxes. And their incomes are, because they're very wealthy people, not really based on paychecks. They're based on investment earnings and that sort of thing, capital gains. So as the state budget has grown, the dependence of that budget on a relative handful of taxpayers has also increased, creating a syndrome known in the Capitol as volatility. It's very, very difficult to depict, to estimate from one year to the next how well a handful of rich people are doing on their investments. And that is the major source of money for the state budget. And the recent history of the budget illustrates that problem. When COVID-19 hit the state in 2020, 3 years ago, it was assumed that we were going to have a terrible recession. And in a sense, we did. The state shut down much of the state's economy. And in doing so, threw almost 3 million Californians out of work. So by definition, that's kind of a recession, right? But what happened, so it was also assumed that the state was going to see a big decline in revenue because of this recession. As it turned out, however, the state's revenue really didn't suffer very much because the people who, those rich people, the wealthiest people, the affluent people who pay those income taxes did not suffer from COVID-19's economic impacts. They had their jobs. They worked from home. They still had their investments and so forth. So the state miscalculated the effect of a recession, which in a way is understandable because nothing like that had ever happened before. So they fashioned a budget in 2020 assuming that there was going to be this big decline in revenues. And then it turned out that it wasn't true, and the state actually started seeing surpluses. The revenues actually were very, very healthy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So much so that a year ago, when the governor and the legislature were fashioning the 2022-23 budget, fiscal year budget, the governor said we had a $97 billion surplus and bragged about it, being no state has ever had a surplus as large as this in the history of mankind. And they passed a budget based on that. They passed out money based on that assumption. For example, the checks that most Californians got later in the year, it was termed in several different ways, but basically it was a rebate. It was a cash in your pocket payment. It cost about $9 billion. There were a lot of enhancements of various spending programs, as well as creating some new spending programs because the state thought it had all of this extra money. But within a few weeks, really, of passing that budget, it became evident that that money was not going to be there, that it was a miscalculation. So there was a miscalculation because of the pandemic, and there was another miscalculation coming out of the pandemic, and then there was a third miscalculation. So this recent history of budgeting in California has been a really erratic experience. So the governor then in January, 6 months into the fiscal year where we supposedly had almost $100 billion surplus, comes out with his budget in January and says, no, we don't have a $100 billion surplus, we have a $22 billion deficit. And the legislative analyst says, no, it's going to be bigger than $22 billion. And this week, I think on Friday, I believe, the governor's going to unveil what's called the May revise. And he's probably going to say that the budget deficit has gotten bigger, from $22 billion to $30 billion. Who knows? It might even be higher than that. Why? Because, once again, the state kind of miscalculated the economy, and in doing so, miscalculated revenues.
But Walters, there was a particular blind spot this year that was caused by the winter storms, right? Isn't that a factor?
The winter storms were a factor of sorts, but also another factor is the fact that we have now extended the income tax deadline until October, so they can't really have a real strong estimate a realistic estimate of revenues based on the April 15th deadline. And finally, they really kind of miscalculated the impacts of the Federal Reserve Board raising interest rates, which has had a depressing impact on the sorts of capital investments from which the state garners so much of its income. So now suddenly, instead of having a $100 billion surplus, we have a deficit of probably $30 billion plus. So then the question is, what to do about it? And basically, in the kind of the macro sense, there are three opposing approaches. We don't know exactly what the governor is going to say. We kind of know what he's not going to do. And he's not going to raise taxes. That's what he says. Because when the Senate came out with their budget, they say raise corporate taxes to support and protect all of the programs that are in danger of being reduced. And the governor immediately said, no, we're not going to raise corporate taxes. In the meantime, the Assembly, Mr. Rendon's outfit, he says basically we ought to dip into the state's rainy day reserves, which are fairly substantial, like $30 billion or something sitting in the bank. So theoretically, you could take those reserves and cover the entire deficit and everything would be hunky-dory, except that those reserves are supposed to be there for the possibility of a serious recession, which may be coming. The economists are not in agreement on whether it's coming. Certainly the Federal Reserve Board is trying to slow down the economy. The question is whether it dips into a recession. And so there you have these kind of three things. The governor will probably suggest more cutting of expenditures. He's already trying to claw back some of the stuff that was approved last year, but money that was appropriated but never spent. He's trying to claw that back, and he says he doesn't want to raise taxes. The Senate says raise taxes. Mr. Rendon and his group say let's tap into the reserves. So going into the last month of the budget process, which is supposed to end on June 15th, because the Constitution says it has to be done by June 15th, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how the state's going to deal with what appears to be a very, very serious budget deficit. Accordingly, all the interest groups who have stakes in that budget are busily doing what you're going to be doing, which is trying to protect your share of the pie. And even some groups are saying not only protect, but enhance. The hospital and the mass transit sectors are all claiming that they're facing imminent disaster, economic disaster, if the state doesn't give them billions of dollars. This is what Jerry Brown would call a very yeasty mixture. It's bubbling along and nobody knows where it's going to end.
And so what do you think the fact that the tax revenues really won't be known until the fall when the budget will be done and the legislature will be all home, they won't be in Sacramento, how do you think that will impact the way that they craft this budget?
I think the budget that's passed in June will not be the final budget. The law says they have to pass a budget or the legislators lose their salaries. That's a great motivation to pass the budget by June 15th. In fact, one year they didn't do it and they lost their salaries for a while. But that doesn't end the process. You can pass a budget on June 15th and modify it any number of times. They're still modifying last year's budget. In fact, they're still modifying the previous year's budget. So that's probably going to be essentially a placeholder budget based on a lot of guesses that are a little more uncertain than usual because, as Laurel says, we really don't have hard numbers on revenues with the delay in the income tax filing period, that all-important personal income tax that's 3/4 of the state budget. So they're going to take some guesses, and they're going to pass a budget. And they're going to put a lot of contingencies in that budget, probably. And they're going to be modifying it, they're going to modify it, they're going to modify it, and it'll be modified. They'll be modifying that budget a year from now, without any doubt whatsoever. So we used to look at the state budget as a kind of once it's done, one and done. Now the state budget process goes on 365 days a year, modifying through a whole bunch of things called budget trailer bills. Watch out for budget trailer bills. Great mischief is done in budget trailer bills. But yeah, this is not going to be a final budget on June 15th. This is going to be a first crack at it because they just can't do it that accurately with this income tax delay.
I think I'm getting the sign that it's time for us to wrap up. So thanks and have a wonderful time in Sacramento.